and welcome to tonight's hypnosis tutorial, language of hypnosis tutorial, where we're going to cover syntactical ambiguity, where we take the verb, place it from a noun, and add ing. So we take the verb, place it from a noun, and add ing. Let me give you a couple of textbook examples. I have running shoes. Do I have a pair of shoes that run? Or do I have a pair of shoes I use for running? The ambiguity is, do I have a pair of shoes that run? Or do I have a pair of shoes I use for running? It could be one interpretation, the other, either or, both. They were milking cows. Were they milking cows physically, or were the cows for milking? Can be the ambiguity, the interpretation can be one or the other, or both. Hypnotizing hypnotist can be tricky. So we take the verb, place it in front of the noun, and add ing. Syntactical ambiguity. When a function, the syntactic, or a word cannot be immediately determined by the immediate context. Now, many years ago, I was on a course, a training course, and I remember someone mentioning that Milton Erickson, and if you don't know the story behind Milton Erickson, I've talked about in previous videos. To cut a long story short, had polio, and prognosis wasn't great. He was given a short time to live. If my memory serves correct, at one point it was literally overnight, and he asked if he could face the sunrise in the morning, the bed would face the sunrise, in case that was the last sunrise he would see. Something along them lines anyway, to cut a long story short. Anyway, the moral of the story is that he survived that night. He went on to survive a lot longer than anyone imagined, or at least he must have imagined on some level that he would go on and live a lot longer than anyone gave him a prognosis for. He'd gone on to become one of the greatest, if not the greatest therapist, in the therapist of any generation. Now, long story short, he was experimenting with language. Polio, he was physiologically debilitated. And he experimented with language. I remember someone mentioning to me one time that he would say things like, loving lovers live longer. Or biting dogs can be dangerous. So the interpretation would be biting dogs, or biting dogs, getting bitten by a dog, could be dangerous. It could be one interpretation or the other. And that wasn't the only thing he would do, but he would experiment with language and study people and see what their reaction would be, see what they would do. And that obviously would be, in many people's opinion, significant in his development in becoming great as a therapist and helping people get results, and results that no one had ever seen, at least in that generation. So a verb, we place the verb in front of a noun and ing. So a verb is an action. A verb is something that you do, just to clarify. A verb is something that you do. A noun is a person, a place, or a thing. And then you add ing, like we've mentioned there. I have running shoes. I have running shoes. So the shoes I use for running, or it's the shoes that run. It can be one interpretation or the other. And you might be asking yourself, why would you use that sort of language? And I've explained in previous seminars why you would use language in that way, because it's counterintuitive. We use indirect language because people, if they could have solved the problem, they would have already solved it. They would have solved it already if they could have solved it. So we can be counterintuitive, and I'll sort of briefly go over a few things this evening as we go along, how this language would be quite useful to have. It's useful to have that. If we waited until the end of the sentence, we'd be hopelessly lost. It requires a lot of cognitive energy to roll back to reprocess a sentence. Ambiguity gives you the opportunity to drop in suggestions. Ambiguity causes confusion, distraction. It's a bit like when you're speaking to someone in a deep conversation and the phone rings, you pick up the phone and you go back to the conversation and you can't remember what you're saying, you've got that sort of amnesia, you don't remember what you're saying. So ambiguity can also help people develop a more resourceful state. connect to a more resourceful state. I find it useful when I'm teaching and doing seminars. I can send a message to one member of the group and send a message to the rest of the group. I can send a message to various people in the group. So it's a way of sending messages using story, metaphor, ambiguity, indirect language. It's a bit like you've been in a conversation where you had 2 or 3 friends and you said one thing to one friend and you sort of directed it to the other in an indirect way. We speak in an indirect way to get messages across. And certainly on courses and conferences and seminars, I've done it myself. To give you an example, I was teaching a course recently on weight reduction and hypnosis, and I had a volunteer who volunteered to come up to do the session, hypnosis session, and it was quite fascinating really, because we had a conversation at break time, a philosophical conversation about good people, about bad people, and how we interpret a good or bad person, and we got on the topic of relationships and we started speaking about different things, and this was during the break anyway. We got into a philosophical conversation, and one of the members of the group talked about her relationship that she had with someone, and she talked about the person that she was with, and she talked about how challenging the relationship became, and so on and so forth really, and she talked about her partner and what he did and some of the bad things he did, and so on and so forth anyway. And this sort of went on, and we sort of world views and that sort of stuff really. We talked about how some good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people, and life isn't always fair. It became philosophical. Anyway, cutting a long story short, she volunteered to do the session. She'd come up and did the session, and the demonstration was going to be around helping her around her emotional eating. And she'd suffered a few setbacks in her life. She had a few setbacks in her life, and one of the things that she'll do as a coping strategy, at least unconsciously, is utilize food for emotional reasons. And what she would do is find herself in the evening going to the kitchen and eating food, and she'd find herself eating all the wrong foods at the wrong time, and so on and so forth. So, cutting a long story short, I'd utilise that when she volunteered, and in an indirect way, what I did is, and you can email me, I think someone recorded the session, you can see some of the session in some detail. I don't think all the sessions recorded, but some of it's recorded. But what I would do in an indirect way, I would utilise ambiguity also, as well as the other patterns I was using to help her overcome the issue that she had. So what I did is to dissociate from the emotion. I'd say, for example, throwing bad food out of the fridge because it contaminating good food. So one of the things I said, throwing as a verb and action, food, so bad food anyway, throwing it out of the fridge, contaminating good food. And the reason for doing that was for her because she mentioned she'd go to the fridge to eat all the wrong foods at the wrong time. Also, it was a double-edged sword. And the double-edged sword was, in her mind, she was, with the association of this past relationship, it appeared that she was damaging future potential relationships because she was still focused on what went on. The emotions and feelings she experienced in that relationship were like a tumbleweed in the desert, attaching themselves to any other potential relationships you could have had. Not only personal relationships, and also the view of the world. And we know if we want to make a difference in the world or for ourselves, the best place to start is focusing on what's right. If we focus on what's right with ourselves, if we focus on what's right in the world, it's a good start to make an impact. Yet ultimately, in her own mind, this focus on this relationship, and this started building a belief around people, herself, the world, bad people, and yeah, life isn't fair, we know that. Certain things happen to certain people, but life is also wonderful and beautiful. And the metaphor I would use And the ambiguity I would use would be throwing bad food out of the fridge so it doesn't contaminating good food. So in her mind, dissociating from the negative emotion. The negative emotion was driving that behaviour, the behaviour being going to the fridge and eating all the wrong foods at the wrong time. So dissociating from the emotion, the feeling, the behaviour, putting it out there, and associating to a more resourceful state. She had control in other areas of her life and extending that control to her eating and identifying other things that she could do, ranging from eating high nutritional foods with high nutritional values, ranging from replacing one food with another, ranging from going for a walk, reading a book in adverse to eating, and focusing on things she enjoyed doing and doing more of them, and replacing that with the eating food at the wrong times. And as a result of doing that, also the world in general, once again letting people in their own time and their own pace, extending the comfort zone, in adverse to bringing that judgment from what's happened in the past, not making light of it, into the future. Because if we will see what we see, and we know if we believe something, it becomes our reality, in the sense that we'll notice things, and even if that's not the case with certain people, we'll put the blinkers on. And I've utilised that in a way, and it was quite effective. And that's sort of giving you a bit of an example of how it can be done in a teaching environment. So when I teach, it's quite a useful thing. So it's an indirect way, and it softens the rigidity. The quickest way from A to B, I take your point, is going to be a straight line. I agree entirely, yet all that's said and done is the person could have solved the issue, they would have solved it already anyway. So for example, it's like telling someone who's anxious to relax. Just relax, just relax. They've probably told themselves that 1,000 times before, and you're adding to that, and people have told them anyway. So perhaps it might be an idea to use something different, something counterintuitive. Now, the indirectness, we've got to consider the situation and the outcome. And I've mentioned that before. I think it's really important to know the person that you're working with. I remember once one of my teachers, Dr. Jeffrey Zai, who set up the Erickson Foundation in Arizona, said the indirectness is the level of proportional resistance you have. Then my words, not just. My understanding of that is the person really buys into what you do, they know what you do, all their families come to see you, they work with you, they buy into you, then you can be more direct. If the person has seen 20 therapists and coaches and it's all gone horribly wrong, and they say you're rubbish, it's never going to work, then you might want to go a bit more indirect. That's sort of an example, because sometimes over-compliance can be a resistance too, because people can just comply for the sake of complying, and we've got to find ways of measuring it. And the outcome is one way to measure it, and you can use quantifying measures, like on a scale to 0 to 100, 100 being high, to measure things like anxiety or nerves, or so on and so forth. There's another story for another day. But I'll give you an idea where it's quite useful to take the verb and place it before a noun and add ing, because we're causing that element of confusion, that tranciness that happens in the person's mind, and the person's confused at that point, and that gives us a chance also to bring in suggestions. It gives us the opportunity to interrupt that process, that pattern, because when we're processing language, there's a huge rushing intake of information that hits our brain. And a normal conversation is about 200 words per minute, and we're looking for our mental dictionary to absorb all that in a very short space of time and look to make sense of that in the best possible way we can. And this is a useful way. It's not the only way. There are ways that we've talked about before, and I'm not advising to use this. You just use it as an extension to your skills, and I utilise that in that situation I mentioned with the woman in the demonstration, which you can watch. It's on YouTube somewhere, when she volunteered. And it's a tool, it's a skill that you can have, like any language of hypnosis or any language in any sense or any technique or process you utilize. The key element there is to use it as and when you feel necessary. If one thing isn't working, then do something different. And this is really, really powerful stuff. And this is quite a useful way of communicating to people because it's really counterintuitive. So for me going forward, because we're running out of time now, one way to practice it would be to be aware of it. Notice where you hear it and be more aware of it. Bring it into your conscious awareness and you become a lot more aware of it. That's one way to get better at this way of communicating. And going from there, one thing you can do too is list a series of verbs and add ing. So for example, you could write down in your own time, in your own pace, just a series of verbs and just add ing. So for example, you could do absorbing. Okay, could be one. You could do accessing. Another. You could do actualizing. Okay, aligning. So you could list a series of verbs and add ing. Then what you can do is on another column, just put a series of nouns if you wanted to. So noun, you could say values. You could put down mobile, you could put down school, you could put down piano, person, place or thing, scientist, and then just practice matching the two together. So you can put down relaxing, and you could put down thoughts, and you can match them together, relaxing thoughts. You could accessing school, you could put aligning values. You can play around with that. And you could go through the alphabet and take a series of words, action words, and then you can put a series of nouns and mix and match and play around with it. That's a really good way to make it a conscious competence, because whenever you start learning, we're sort of consciously incompetent. Like when we first drive a car, first gear, second gear, stall, consciously we're thinking really, really hard and a lot of energy to process that. Then you get like conscious competence where you can consciously put it through the gears, first gear, second gear, third. Then you get that unconscious incompetence where sometimes you're driving along, you don't really notice anything, you don't notice the traffic lights, you don't notice the stop sign, you stop and go, then you stall. And then you become unconsciously competent where you drive, and unless you drive to a new destination, you're sort of on autopilot. And this is the same thing, and a really, really exercise to learn this, what I find really, really useful to do, is just to, like I said, just do columns and write down like a series of verbs, add ing, like believing, and you can work your way through the alphabet. You don't have to work through the alphabet. That's sort of something you could do. Something like believing, being, meeting, and so on and so forth. Then on the other side, you could put a list of nouns, and you can sort of play around and match them together and see how you go. It's quite a useful thing. So you put meeting scientist, meeting being calm. You could believing mobile. That's really, really out there. Yet I'm just saying play around with it, and you can sort of play with one or the other or both, and mix and match and so on and so forth. So remember the noun being a person, place, thing, and the verb being an action word, and just play around with it. Play around with it. I gave you a couple of textbook examples earlier. For example, I mentioned I have running shoes, do I have a pair of shoes that run, or do I have a pair of shoes I use for running. And it talks about they were milking cows, the cows are milking, or were they milking cows physically. Hypnotizing hypnosis can be tricky, relaxing thoughts. So the list goes on, and you can get a whole series of verbs, add ing, absorbing, accessing, actualizing, believing, being, meeting, relaxing, playing piano, for example. So the verb in front of the noun, and just play around with it and utilize. And remember, all these things really, you work towards an outcome. That's the important thing to remember. You're working towards an outcome. So the person gives you an outcome that they want, something that they'd like to achieve, and we can work towards an outcome. For me, you've got a target to aim for. So the woman I mentioned earlier, her outcome was to work on her emotional eating, which she volunteered on the course. So I also had an outcome for her too, in my mind, that was more process orientated. One, I asked on a scale of 1 to 100 how high, from an emotional point of view, the feelings were whenever she felt the urge to eat all the wrong things at the wrong time. She described her feeling as being sad and lonely. As a scale of 1 to 100, 100 being high, how high is that? And she said 80, and I said, my goal was, okay, in the time frame we had, considering it was a demonstration, can we focus on bringing it down to say 20, for example? And in my mind, and if we can do that, then that's obviously going to have an impact on her eating. Beyond that, it's something that she could work on, and she gave good feedback. That sort of gives you an idea. So the outcome, her outcome is to minimize the eating, and one of the ways of doing that is focusing on the emotion, because she's not eating all the time, certainly in that situation, and there are certain times and certain triggers and so on and so forth. So that's just giving an example. I'm not going to go into that, it's another story for another day, but do practice. It's a great skill to have, and it's just practice. That's the important thing for me to get better at it, just practicing and in your own pace, in your own time, and utilising what's effective. You don't have to use every language pattern all the time. You just bring in whichever one's appropriate in a specific situation. And yeah, of course, we want to be as direct as possible, where possible, but in certain situations we have to be a bit more counterintuitive, and the person's already tried a number of things and it's not working, then it might be an idea to do something different. Take a different road. If the person's gone down this road and they keep going on the same road, and they get to the roundabout and they keep going on the same road, it might be an idea when they get to the roundabout again, give a different roundabout a go. Or give a different road a go. Because we know on a roundabout, you take one road can take you to a whole new destination. Well, miles apart, on one side of the country, the other side of the country. So ultimately, in the end, we can take another road. If that's not working, then come back and take another road. If that's not working, take another road. And that's the useful thing about all this, and I've mentioned that in other videos. It's just another skill you can have for the extension of capabilities. And I'm not implying to this that you should use it. It's your call. I'm just putting it out there, and it's just an education process that I'm giving you some information on. So